More and more of us understand the importance of physical activity, of eating nutritious food, of the importance of stress management and sleep and vitamins and nutrients, and prevent, not getting, let's say, sunburnt and the causes, how that might lead to cancer. But on the other hand, we're also seeing a shift in lifestyles toward the negative. Something we talk about in public health and epidemiology is called the epidemiological transition. This is when countries become wealthier or their GDP increases, and you see how the lifestyle of their population shifts from, let's say, more manual labor, agricultural, subsistence-based jobs to more, let's say, high-end white-collar jobs, mostly sitting at a desk, the 9 to 5, or if you're in consulting, the 8 to 12 sometimes. And what this means from a lifestyle perspective, you have a more sedentary life. You are sitting at a desk, you're not moving, you're not out in the field toiling. And so what does this mean for your health? It means you are being less active, there's less physical activity, there's potentially less exercise, there's more stress. And so what kind of chronic conditions does that lead to? Part of the epidemiological transition of countries as well is that you see the burden of disease, so the cause of sickness, the cause of mortality or death, shifting from being preventable infectious diseases to being more preventable, if it's lifestyle, chronic or non-communicable, non-infectious diseases. And these are usually long-term diseases due to lifestyle, things like cardiovascular disease, hypertension, dyslipidemia, diabetes, obesity and overweight, and so on and so forth. The next point that we're seeing as a driver of change is technological and medical advancement shifting the relative disease burden. So I touched on this a bit. So the disease burden, of course, originally being more around communicable or infectious diseases that could be prevented via medication, vaccination, proper hygiene, to more chronic or lifestyle or long-term diseases. Now, technological and medical advancement have helped us prevent these preventable diseases, again, from happening or from killing us too soon. But what does this mean? It means that the disease burden has now shifted to the longer-term diseases. So these technological advancements have helped us preserve our life or elongate our life, but they are now creating a burden on health systems because we now have diseases of old age that we didn't used to have about a century ago. We have more burden on healthcare systems when you see older people or people living longer starting to suffer from cancer, from some other chronic conditions that are due to, of course, a longer life. Emerging global health challenges. So this is a huge one. I'm not going to spend too long on that because it's like opening a can of worms. One global health challenge, like we mentioned before, is globalization, migration, and the associated spread of disease that happens with it. Outbreaks, epidemics, pandemics. A massive global health challenge we're seeing and we've been discussing within the public health arena is climate change. Climate change, of course, it can mean that warm places are getting warmer, cold places are getting colder, ice caps are melting, ocean levels are rising. But what does that mean for health? It means we're forcing people eventually to become not just economic migrants, but environmental migrants. What does this mean from a personal well-being perspective? It also means that we are shifting the direction or the trajectory of disease vectors. And disease vectors are animals, humans, organisms, or hosts that carry disease from one place to another, or from one a susceptible individual to another. And so we're starting to see more tropical diseases like dengue, West Nile virus, certain types of neglected tropical diseases like leptospirosis, Chagas, moving away from the tropics, so away from the equator where it's warm and humid and a great, hotbed for vector development like mosquitoes, moving north and south to colder areas. Why? Because these colder areas are becoming warmer. So now these disease-carrying vectors can survive there. Let me stop talking about global health challenges because I could talk about this for hours. Let's then move to changing structure and configuration of the built environment. We know that the natural environment is what's around us, the air we breathe, the trees, the greenery around us, the ozone being polluted with our fossil fuels. But then we have the built environment. This is the environment that we as humans have created. Those are buildings, civil infrastructure, roads, bridges. Are these accessible? Do persons with disability or persons of determination, as we call them in the UAE, do they have equitable access to the built environment, into buildings, into sports arenas, into gyms? And what about the built environment is perhaps leading us to live unhealthier lives? Are we too comfortable? We no longer have to walk. We just take cars everywhere. Why don't we bike? Is there public transportation that could help decrease the amount of fossil fuels that we burn with combustible engines and pollute the environment? So these are some of the drivers of change that we're seeing that have been changing health and our population's well-being status, and will continue to do so, either for the better or for the worse. Now, with these drivers of change, we've started identifying some global health challenges, and I've already mentioned some of these, so I'll go briefly over the ones that I mentioned. One of the main challenges, if not the number one challenge, which a lot of organizations have mentioned as the number one challenge, is climate change. So certain regions' subtropical arid climate make them especially vulnerable to climate change. I'm talking about ourselves here in the GCC, in Dubai, and KSA, and in some of the desert countries. This exerts pressure on water supplies and food security. The hotter it gets, the more water we need. In a desert location, water, fresh water, potable water doesn't come as easily. So what does that mean for our water supplies, for our animals, for our crops, for ourselves? And then also, what does that mean in terms of food security? So food security is the availability or accessibility that people have to the necessary food that they need to live, to sustain, to grow, to be nutritious and be healthy. Additionally, these countries facing climate change, I mean the whole world, but especially subtropical and arid climate countries, must consider worsened natural disasters, as well as air pollution, which can exacerbate existing air quality challenges in these regions. And we're seeing an increase in natural disasters as we speak. More hurricanes or cyclones, more floods, more monsoons, more, unfortunately, earthquakes, and a lot of this can be due to climate change. Another challenge, a global challenge that affects us all locally, is population influx. Again, I've mentioned the high levels of migration, as well as international visitors that many countries are hosting, but which makes them especially prone to the transnational spread of disease. As I mentioned, this will be further exacerbated by climate change, which will have significant effects on migration patterns. The third challenge we can look at, which I also mentioned before, is non-communicable diseases or chronic diseases, aka long-lasting lifestyle, mostly lifestyle-associated diseases. So in line with the epidemiological transition of countries that I mentioned in the beginning, many countries' burden of disease is now shifting and will continue to be due to NCDs, and NCDs, non-communicable diseases, such as cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and especially mental health. So this will call for a greater emphasis on more complex, coordinated care and lifestyle interventions. It won't just be anymore about just going to a hospital, going to see your GP or a specialized doctor. You need interventions from education, from social sector, from government, from tourism, perhaps, from sports. The list goes on and on. If we look to the right, we have the global challenge, which has become local, of emerging and re-emerging diseases. Some of this has to do with migration, with globalization. Some of it has to do with climate change, and some of it, we don't know. It could be completely random. But it's become apparent, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic, that novel diseases and the reemergence of existing diseases has become a critical threat to global health security. And so other diseases that we've seen that have reemerged, that were dormant or have come back, are diseases like MERS, SARS, Rift Valley fever. Now, another one of the what I would consider one of the biggest challenges, and we are going to be seeing this threat and this trend in health more and more moving forward, is the challenge of antimicrobial resistance, or AMR. The world must be prepared to address the threat from resistant pathogens, especially as the suboptimal use and the safe use of antibiotics or antimicrobials in many countries are exacerbating the rise of AMR in the region. So I guess pose a question to yourself. If you are sick and you have a sore throat and fever that's not going away, you go to the pharmacist, they'll give you some paracetamol, acetaminophen, ibuprofen, Panadol, Advil, Tylenol. If you ask them for antibiotics, saying, I need something strong, I need something, do you know that antibiotics only kill bacteria? They don't only turn off or kill, we can't kill viruses, but lessen the effects of a virus. Do you need a prescription for antibiotics? If the answers to these is no, it probably means that you've taken antibiotics when you shouldn't have. And what that does is, because there is no specific or targeted bacteria to kill, the other bad bacteria in your body is learning to create resistance. So it's saying, this antibiotic hurt me, but it didn't kill me. Let me become stronger so that in the future, it does nothing to me. It doesn't even hurt me. And so we're going to see the emergence of these superbugs, what we call superbugs, that are resistant to antibiotics, which means that we would have to then start using more and more broad spectrum antimicrobials, which are much harsher on the body, don't always work, and create another threat to health and health security. And then finally, we are looking at biosecurity and physical threats. With this newfound knowledge, new accessible knowledge, the democratization of data, we also have the democratization of health information, both good and bad and bad. So that means that people, governments, opponents, however you want to describe it, know what you need to have good health to protect the population, but they also know another way to put populations at risk or threaten them. So due to countries' global embeddedness and high levels of trade, they'll need to conduct active surveillance of disease-causing agents and their vectors. Additionally, they will need to monitor potential chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and explosive, so CBRNE threats. Within health, we would be looking at the biological threats, sometimes chemical. So what is to stop, let's say, an enemy group or a group of terrorists, or perhaps in an act of war, for a certain group to release a biological agent that affects people's respiratory tracts, there are no vaccines for it, and people just die. How different is that from someone perhaps placing an explosive device or attacking a submarine? It's these new ideas, this information that's available, that's also making us obviously more vulnerable, more powerful, but at the same time, potentially more vulnerable. So in these future trends of health, we have to see these as both challenges, but also opportunities. Opportunities for better quality of life, better well-being status, but also opportunities for us to learn from these and not let them become threats to us. So in order to solve these challenges or to use these opportunities, I am proposing 3 domains to address. So health and well-being efforts must address these 3, in my opinion, indispensable domains in order to drive sustained and comprehensive improvements to individuals and society. These are health outcomes, health equity, and the wider determinants of health that we discussed before. And of course, I have these surrounded by health and all policies, which is an area that I've worked in, and is this idea fairly new, not fairly new, but it was in the early 2000s, originated by Finland, that countries and governments have to make a commitment that any current and future policies will not hurt population health, but it instead will help population health and health equity. That means that policies around trade, perhaps around electric vehicles, policies around human resources and social development have to take population health and health equity into account. And this is how I conclude my hopefully quick presentation. I promised I would keep it to 30 minutes or less, and I would love to take some of your questions or comments. Thank you so much. So I think there is,
thank you.
Nice question.
Yeah, thank you so much for your session, insightful indeed. We're now open to questions. You can type it in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and ask them yourself.
We have a question. What is a flux?
Great. So flux, we use it a lot, I think, in the vernacular. The actual definition of flux is something flowing in and out. Sometimes you use it as change, as constant movement, but it's really the process of flowing in or flowing out. So populations in flux or migration in flux means that there's constant change, constant movement, constant flow.
Any other questions?
So I guess if there are no questions, I have some questions to pose for you, maybe as a little bit of an icebreaker, or just some thinking. So would you, before this this session, did you normally define health only as physical health? So, you know, I don't have a cold, I don't have a fever, I'm active. Or did you also take into account social and mental health? We didn't touch so much on the social, but did you define health as also being social and mental? Also, Malak and Wa'il, if you want to answer, please feel free.
Would give the chance for students to do that.
I'll take that as a yes. Should we talk about perhaps potential opportunities when it comes to jobs and studies, when it comes to different areas of health?
Actually, yes, I was meaning to say that to you. So if you could touch upon a little about, because mostly students have joined us here. So if you could touch upon a little of, you know, careers in healthcare, or that would be something insightful for them to learn from.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I'd love to. So I'll talk a little bit about my experience, which was a little unconventional, and then take it from there. So we know that some of the typical, or I guess most common jobs in health, or what people would think about the most is, okay, doctor, nurse practitioner, physician's assistant, so really care providers. But health is such a broad term, as you can see here. Pretty much anyone playing a role in any of these elements or pivot elements could potentially work in health. So for me, I went into university thinking I was going to study, you know, international relations and, you know, political economy. And I ended up doing biotech and global health, but of course within a science degree. So for me, that opened a lot of doors because it had the global health aspect. You can play a role in non-governmental organizations focused on social care, health, you know, children's safety, population well-being. You could work for international organizations like I did with the World Health Organization, sister organizations of it, like the International Organization for Migration. You have UNICEF, which is the UN's Children Protection Fund. You have the UN Women's Fund, and of course, this is within the UN system. Countries themselves have specific health initiatives. In Dubai, for example, the Mohammed bin Rashid Global Initiative is a philanthropic and charitable organization, but part of their work is to provide charity and philanthropies to hospitals or to entities and organizations helping population health. You can always work for government. So the regulators of health, aka the decision makers, the policy makers, are usually the government. So ministries of health, city health departments, regional health departments. You could become an epidemiologist, which is someone who studies the patterns and history of disease and what that means from a future sense of disease. Physical therapists can help you with more physical ailments. Mental health specialists look at the psychological aspect of health, whether that be from a medical perspective, like a psychiatrist, from just a mental, non-medical perspective, like a psychologist or a therapist, and so on and so forth. We can even say that cooks, nutritionists, dietitians, of course, are all healthcare workers or health workers, even if it's a little extended, because we are impacting people's nutritional health. There are roles in academia. There are roles in research. So before, even when I was in the World Health Organization, a big chunk of my work was research and publishing, not just publishing articles and books, but literally performing research to either discover or solve problems. And so that's also at the crux of science. It's the the goal of discovery or the goal of information sharing of your problem solving or the solutions that you've found. So they're really different opportunities. I'd say, I guess I forgot to say consulting, which is my current opportunity. And consulting is really advising your clients on how to become more efficient, how to get better solutions, perhaps how to make more profit, save more lives, cut costs, impact more population. It depends. But within consulting, I've carved a niche for health strategy. So it's really helping different health clients, which are governments, which are hospitals, insurance schemes, private companies, pharmaceutical companies who create drugs and vaccines, on how they can do better, how they can have more impact on population health and health equity. If you are actively looking for jobs, I always recommend looking at the big federal job searches. So maybe something like, US jobs might not apply for anyone who isn't a US citizen. You can get an idea of the kind of work that, let's say, the US government is doing, and then see whether your home government is doing work like that. Going into the websites of key, let's say, health universities. And again, I know the ones in the US because that's where I studied. That's something like going to the career site or the alumni site for Johns Hopkins will tell you what kind of job offers the university has within lab work, research, field work experience, or can also connect you with professors doing work outside of the university, or who might be connected to different health organizations. And of course, what's great about health is that you can really define it. It's a huge spectrum. You can go from working pro bono to working on the ground with Doctors Without Borders, working with some non-governmental organizations or international organizations, to working in the corporate private sector, making more money, less money, etc. It really depends on what your passion is, how you define it, and then trying to find a niche, trying to carve a little area, and hopefully improving population health and health equity. I get a question from Pranay. Is the US good for research fellowships in drug development and management? So I would say it depends on the institution. So are you looking for research fellowships through a university or through an institution like the NIH, the National Institute of Health? I would say yes, it's great. These fellowships are quite competitive. So my suggestion would be to go through an institution, and by institution I mean an academic institution, a university. Many universities don't have ties to pharmaceutical companies just because of the ethical considerations there. But instead of talking about, let's say, drug development or APIs, which are active pharmaceutical ingredients, you could do research on vaccine development or screening or therapies to help combat addiction or abuse. But definitely I would suggest going through universities or institutions and see what kind of research fellowships they have for US citizens, for international students. See whether they have ties to your current academic institution, whether there's opportunities for an exchange program, and perhaps build that way. The UN General Headquarters they used to have a global youth program that allowed youth under certain age, I think it was youth under 21, and then there's another one for youth under 30, to work with the UN, to work with the World Bank as well, or the IMF, for up to a year or 2 years, and receive a salary and gain that information, then bring that information back home. So that's a great fellowship opportunity, not so much research, but for real life experience. And then I have a question from Lynn. Lynn, you see, do I think health inequalities are widening in the 21st century? Great, very difficult question. I would say yes and no. And so first, we have two different definitions here. We have health inequality and health inequity. So inequality might just mean difference in your health status. But health equity is about having the same opportunities, same access to health or health care, or the same opportunities to prevent an inequality. I think in certain areas, like having access to vaccines, having access to required care. If you're a woman, we are still not doing very well. There's a big gap all around the world, not just in certain areas, but there's a big gap around bodily autonomy, around women's pain not being taken as seriously in some provider settings. There's a gap amongst countries about who can access vaccines, who can pay for vaccines, which governments can provide necessary preventive care for their populations. So I do think that health inequalities are still not fixed, and they're widening in that sense. But then when we're looking at issues like not, under 5 mortality, so the death of children due to preventable, diarrheal diseases, water hygiene, things like cholera, in many countries, we're seeing that this is becoming less and less. So the mortality rate for women and children, for maternal child mortality rates, maternal mortality ratio, we're looking at under 5 mortality. These situations seem to be improving. But of course, this is notwithstanding and barring exceptions like places dealing with famine, with war. So countries like Yemen, now unfortunately countries like Syria and Turkey, who have been destroyed due to natural disasters, war, conflict, and we do see things that were preventable. Death, disease, morbidity that used to be preventable, that were preventable up to a certain point, are now going back and now are actually increasing. And so that's unfortunate. I hope that answers the question. I know I rambled a lot, but it's a big area of passion for me and where I do a lot of research. So I could talk about it for hours. Pranay, are the UN and the WHO working strictly toward people after post-COVID more efficiently and effectively? Sorry, I don't fully understand the question, but is the question about whether the UN and WHO are working more efficiently and effectively now in a post-COVID world? Got it. Okay. It's a bit of a loaded question, and it's also very subjective. I think I'm trying to see whether I can answer this theoretically rather than scientifically or empirically, and I don't think I can answer this officially or scientifically or empirically. What I can say is that the WHO is a nonprofit organization. So there is this misconception that, the WHO, is corrupt. They just want donation money and then they steal it. That's not what happens. It's so bureaucratic. Like I can tell you the years I spent there, oh my gosh, there's so many layers. It's literally impossible to misappropriate funds unless, of course, the funds go to a non-WHO entity and then who knows what they're used for. Now, is it done efficiently? Is the work done efficiently? The goal, the intention is yes, absolutely. But the reality is not always. As with these global, as with many of these global institutions, global organizations, there is so much bureaucracy, there is so much hierarchy. Sometimes you need so many approvals for one minor thing that you feel time is ticking, the clock is ticking, time is passing by, and you're not seeing the change that you want. And I can personally attest to this. So moving from the UN and WHO system to a very fast-paced industry or line of work like consulting, I realized like, oh my gosh, I would work so long on strategies, on papers, on these recommendations for governments that would take years to start to be implemented and approved. And then you would have an election cycle, the president or the leader of the country would change, and then you would have to start from scratch. Whereas in consulting, because the work is so much more fast-paced, we serve one client alone. Let's say I only serve for the next 3 months the Ministry of Health in Saudi Arabia. That means that everything I do is only focused on them. They have a goal at the end of 3 months. They need a piece of work which is already approved and then ready to be implemented. And so that's a big difference. So for the UN and WHO, I do think the intention is there. The reality is much more complicated. What's my view on growing populations with respect to health concerns? Is from Ishika. This is a fantastic question. I think I have controversial views on this. I personally think, but I wouldn't put it in writing, is that one of the biggest threats to population health, to climate and sustainability is growing population. So the more people you have, the more pollution there is, the more strain on global resources, and the more likelihood of spread of disease. So I do think that growing populations are often a matter of health concern, depending on where you are. We do have countries where the population could dangerously be decreasing, just like Japan. The population is aging, and then couples from our generation aren't necessarily procreating or having children. So there might get a point where the population pyramid, which traditionally should look like this, is going to start looking like this. And so what does that mean from a country's longevity, its sustainability, the use of its resources, its economy? It's very complicated. I think overall, I think growing populations are definitely a risk to health concerns because of the agricultural aspect, the climate change, pollution aspect, and then strains on health services, but also from a movement, globalization aspect, spread of disease, etc. Aline, do the pros of globalization outweigh its cons? 100%, absolutely yes. I don't know how we would survive in a globe if our world wasn't as globalized as it is. I wouldn't be here. I probably wouldn't be having this talk. I might be back home in Dominican Republic, never having been able to get on a plane and go study abroad. So I do think the pros outweigh the cons. Some of the cons are quite large, quite scary, but I prefer to look at this as a glass half full, more positive, of course, realistically. And I do think they outweigh the cons because globalization allows us to share ideas, share solutions, like literally work hand in hand with other countries for all of us to protect each other, for all of us to share data, advance science, advance knowledge, give access to education to vulnerable populations, protect women and children. Absolutely. Has the Russian-Ukraine conflict affected health and economic development across the world? Another 100% yes, absolutely. So I can talk about some of the health effects that we're seeing in the countries, especially specifically in Ukraine. So in areas of conflict, you start to see what we call internally displaced populations, IDPs. That means people who have lost their homes and have no home to get back to, but are stuck in a country that is still in conflict. And so that means that they no longer have money. They may have lost their jobs, their livelihoods, their savings. What we also see in conflict is the concept of refugees. So these are people who have lost their homes, who have been pushed out of their countries or their borders and don't have a home or a country to go back to. So what does this mean from a health perspective? First of all, mental health is completely destroyed. The amount of stress and trauma and fear that people face is sometimes unmanageable. And so this means that people succumb to mental health issues that could end up taking their lives or could end up giving them such a low quality of life that they would rather not be alive. And this is awful. I worked in refugee settings when I spent 2 years in Lebanon and all through graduate school, and the amount of mental health issues that you see are different, and it goes beyond what we call post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress disorder, but it becomes human devastation. There's a new term called human devastation disorder, and we're seeing that a lot in children born or living in areas of conflicts, children of refugees and internally displaced populations. And so when you have people living in conflict, you start neglecting certain health issues. So when you move into a refugee setting, the main issue is to stop the spread of disease. So of course you do measles vaccinations, you try to prevent HIV, then that means that people are neglecting their cardiovascular or heart health. They are neglecting their weight. If they have chronic conditions, they no longer have the medication for it. And so these become neglected. In terms of economic development, absolutely. Not only is the general population in Ukraine and Russia losing their sense of livelihood, but in Russia, for example, the strength or the stability of what's the currency? Ruble? Forgive me, but the Russian currency has become extremely devalued because Russia is now starting to get boycotted and sanctioned by international trade partners. There's no more international trade. People can't travel to many of these countries. They're being boycotted. And so what this does to the country's economy is it destroys it. It destroys people's livelihood, and it's really hard to come out of it. It's a ripple effect. And then when you think of Russia being a massive supplier of oil and gas to Europe, and Europe no longer purchasing its oil and gas, it creates a domino effect of economic collapse in Russia and of course Ukraine because it's being attacked, but it also creates a domino effect of collapse in utilities and services in the rest of Europe. So now we're seeing a crisis, for example, in the UK, in England and in London, where utilities, electricity, gas are so expensive that in the middle of winter, people are not turning on the heat because they can't afford it, because the supply of gas that may have come from Russia or subsidiaries is no longer coming in. And so you just keep war and conflict, especially for countries that are so entrenched in global trade, create this domino effect that slowly starts rippling across countries, across borders, until eventually you realize, oh my gosh, the entire world is going to be affected by this. Farhanda, can the effects of climate change need to be considered more for health problems, especially in third world countries? Yes, 100%. Unfortunately, developing countries, didn't have this quote unquote benefit that a lot of the developed countries did during the Industrial Revolution and the industrial era of using the power of carbon and coal and fossil fuels to advance, to industrialize, to become these wealthy economic powerhouses that they are today. And so there is an ongoing debate of how do we help developing countries reach these development goals without relying on these, I guess, climate damaging technologies or raw resources and materials. There is an ongoing debate of perhaps, maybe developed or rich countries should pay to offset the carbon footprint of developing countries so that they can help reach that goal more equitably. Because otherwise we are still creating a cycle of inequity where developing countries are still of lower socioeconomic status as compared to developed countries, whereas developed countries have reaped the benefits of technology, knowledge, and advancement that the causes of climate change help them achieve. So yes, the effects of climate change need to be considered more for the health problems, especially in third world countries, from an economic and development perspective. From a pure health perspective, absolutely. We see that a lot of developing, or as you say, third world countries happen to be on the extremes. So you see a lot in sub-Saharan Africa, you see a lot of these countries in Central and South America. And what does this mean? For most of these countries, it's quite hot. It's quite humid or quite arid. And so as climate change happens, it gets hotter. And a lot of the issues we mentioned before start happening. You start seeing dwindling water supplies or fresh water supplies. You start seeing the movement of disease carrying vectors. And these countries currently don't have the opportunity, the finances, the access to vaccines, access to medications to combat these. I hope that's a good answer. I see Ishika, should health be merged with technology from the roots in order to bring stability? Another difficult question. I can't say yes or no. I do think that technology and digital enable many aspects of health, can enhance many aspects of health, but there is an importance for certain areas, especially in public health, to not forget the basics. Because the more you embed technology in health, of course, you can create more advancement, less risk, less morbidity on the population. But you have to also remember that there are still countries and populations without access to these technologies. So you could be driving the digital gap or the technological gap from an equity perspective. So I think I can't say yes or no. I do think we have to strike a balance. If the technology makes health more accessible to everyone, more equitable, more affordable, less, certain responses or aspects or treatments less risky, then yes, absolutely. But if technology will only benefit a small % of the population and further drive the digital or technological divide, then perhaps we should consider whether we use it, and if so, when. Pranay, how can we imagine the world in terms of health and economic development goals in 2050? After whatever happened during 2020 and 2022, the pandemic, conflict ends, and even small countries, being affected a lot. It's hard to imagine the world, the more we go into the future, the the more variables we have to contend with, whereas 100 years ago, we just had to make sure that, the world didn't go into another world war. There wasn't another massive pandemic like the Spanish American flu of 1918. Whereas now there are things to contend with, like data, like technology. We have the big tech giants pretty much ruling the world, making decisions. And technology is so advanced and so rapidly developing that we don't know what it's going to look like 4 years from now, much less from, now till 2050, which is like 27 years from now. It's really hard. I would hope that we would be reaching health and economic goals by then, but I'm worried that we might still be driving the equity divide. We still haven't achieved gender parity and gender equity, not just across finance and business, but really in health, in social care and education. So it's a tough question. I don't think I can answer it. I need more data. And even with the data, I don't know what technology is going to look like. Lynn, are traditional beliefs, I'm just keeping mind of the time, so I can take this question. Are traditional beliefs still threatening health practices like they used to? I would say yes and no. I do think that certain segments of the global population are becoming more health literate. Again, there's a democratization of data, of information. You just need people to understand what the information they're getting. But there are certain traditional beliefs that are threatening health practices. We still see, unfortunately, the incidence of forced child marriage and, child brides around the world. And what does that do to the physical and mental well-being of pretty much children who are being forced into adult situations? The UN, the International Convention on the Rights of the Child, says that this is a global, international, and war crime. It is abuse of children. And so what does that mean from health? But in some subsections of the population and some areas, I wouldn't say ethnicities, it's just some subsections of certain populations, this is still considered tradition. I say certain things threaten health practices in areas of the world or in subsegments of the population where women don't have bodily autonomy, when women can't seek care, own property, or hold a job, go to a doctor alone. I do think these traditions end up threatening health practices, and maybe not as much as they used to, maybe more, but we're still not there. I think there are still some traditional beliefs or traditional misconceptions that are ongoing. And then you can talk about small things, there is still a big stigma worldwide around mental health, and mental health is just as important, if not more important, than physical health. And so what does it mean if you're part of a community where seeking care for mental health, seeking medication for depression, for anxiety disorder, for bipolar, if that's stigmatized, if you will be further mistreated, if you will be ostracized from your community, that will keep you from seeking care. And so this stigma will actually exacerbate your mental health issues. And this is why mental health is so important, and we need to talk about it. But then there are still traditional beliefs that think, no, this, just, toughen up. That's not true. It's all in your head, when literally it's in your head. But if we take such good care of our bodies, why would we not take the same good care of our minds and our heads? So yes, I do think that there are still traditional beliefs threatening health practices. Thank you for that. Very good, very great, tough question. Actually, all of you, thank you so much for these tough questions. You really made me think and try to get good answers. Hope I didn't disappoint. I know we're running out of time, Malak and Wael. Let me know if there's any follow-up. Yeah.
Well, perfect. Thank you so much, Elsie, for that wonderful, insightful session. And finally, the questions started flowing in, and I'm sorry because we have to leave a few, but then you can send us the questions, and we'll probably get them answered from Elsie another time. Thank you all for joining. Malak, if you could end the session, thank you.
Thank you, Elsie. Thanks for the whole participants of this session. It was very enlightening. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. I'm sure that the students and I have learned many new things. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Malak. Thank you for organizing this. Thank you, everyone, for joining, for listening in, for participating, for the great questions. It's been an honor and a pleasure. I love doing this. Hopefully I've encouraged a few of you to pursue the health and health sciences or kind of work in health areas. And hopefully I can answer questions or provide advice if and when needed.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Elsie. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great
Thank you.
Okay.